Hey everybody, it's the Jazz Architect. Welcome back to the Jazz Architect. Today, I want to take on a question that sounds simple, but really it isn't. Does AI actually understand what it says? Think about how strange it felt at first to talk to a computer like it was a person. For me, it was a little bit strange in the beginning. Sometimes I'd look around the room or around the house and make sure no one was watching me. But you know what? I got used to it pretty quickly. It reminds me of when people first started wearing earbuds and walking down the street talking out loud. Years ago, you might have looked at somebody and thought, who are they talking to? Is everything okay over there? Now, people don't even think twice about it. We just assume they're on the phone. Technology changes, and somehow our behavior changes right along with it. And now we're doing something similar with artificial intelligence. We sit down, type a question, or even speak to it, and suddenly we're having what feels like a conversation. We ask AI about grief, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, quantum physics, business, relationships, history, education, music, or almost anything we can think of, and it responds in a way that often sounds thoughtful, informed, and surprisingly human. But here's where it gets interesting. How many times have you been in a conversation with someone and you could almost predict what they're going to say next? Maybe you know them really well, where they're from, what they do for a living, or how they usually tell a story. Sometimes you can hear the rhythm of the sentence, the phrasing, and the setup, and your mind jumps ahead. Every now and then, you might even interrupt them and finish the sentence for them. That kind of prediction feels very human, and in a very simplified way, that gives us a doorway into understanding something that a large language model is doing. It is constantly using context, patterns, relationships, and probability to determine what is most likely to come next. But now we arrive at the real question for today. If something can predict language incredibly well, does that mean it understands the language? That question makes me think about childhood, or even just watching children. How many times have you heard a child repeat something they heard on television, or something they overheard from their parents or another adult? Sometimes they can repeat it almost word for word, and it can even sound pretty sophisticated. A child might repeat a technique or a phrase, a political statement or a medical term, and everybody in the room starts laughing because you know that child probably has no idea what they just said. They have the words, and they may even have the pronunciation, but they don't necessarily understand the significance of those words, the context behind them, or how that information should actually be used. And we see the same thing in music. A student can transcribe an incredible solo, listen to it over and over again, memorize every note, rhythm, articulation, and phrase, and eventually play it back almost perfectly. If you put that student into the exact harmonic situation where the phrase originated or occurred or came from, it would probably sound fantastic. You might say, wow, listen to that. They really know what they're doing. But then change the chord progression, change the tempo, or put a slightly different musical situation in there and say, okay, let's see what you really got. Let's see what you've learned. That is when we really begin to discover whether they understand what they learned or whether they simply memorized the information. Maybe they understood 50% of it, maybe 25%, or maybe they understood nearly all of it. But one of the funniest things that can happen is when somebody learns a beautiful musical phrase and puts it in a completely wrong place, it becomes really obvious. The notes might be right, the rhythm might be right, and the articulation may be perfect. They may have copied the original musician exactly. But if that context is wrong, suddenly this incredible phrase sounds ridiculous. That brings us right back to artificial intelligence. AI can produce language that sounds polished, intelligent, and convincing. And the words can all be there, but producing the right words and understanding the significance of those words may be two different things. Prediction can look remarkably like understanding. Imagine I say, the trumpet player walked onto the stage and raised the... What do you predict I'm going to say next? Maybe you thought trumpet, and that would probably be a pretty strong prediction. I already told you we're talking about a trumpet player and that he walked on the stage. So naturally your mind might think, oh, the trumpet player walked on the stage and raised the trumpet. But trumpet isn't the only possible answer. Maybe the trumpet player walked onto the stage and raised the music. Or maybe he raised the music stand because it wasn't high enough. Maybe he raised his hand just to wave to the audience. Maybe he tried to get the band leader's attention. Who knows? He could have raised his eyebrows for all that matters. There are plenty of possibilities, and the next word depends on everything surrounding the sentence. That's where context becomes extremely important. Human beings bring observation, experience, knowledge of the situation, and sometimes even knowledge of the person speaking. All of that information helps us narrow down what is most likely meant. A language model is also using context and patterns to make a prediction, but probability alone does not guarantee that the prediction reflects the meaning we intend. Modern artificial intelligence also does something more sophisticated than simply looking at the word immediately before the next one. One of the breakthroughs behind today's large language models is something called attention. I don't want to make this sound too technical, but the basic idea is pretty simple. Attention helps the model determine which pieces of information are most important to what it is trying to figure out right now. Suppose I say the trumpet player put the trumpet in the case because it was expensive. What does it refer to? Was the trumpet expensive? Or was the case expensive? Most human beings would probably assume I meant the trumpet because we use the relationships between the words and our knowledge of the world to interpret the sentence. Artificial intelligence uses mathematical relationships and patterns to make those kinds of connections. And again, that can look remarkably like understanding. The system is becoming extremely good at identifying relationships and context. But the bigger question remains. Is choosing the most likely relationship the same thing as understanding why that relationship makes sense? And that brings us to another important point. Fluent language is not the same thing as reliable understanding. We've all heard the expression, you can talk the talk, but can you walk the walk? That saying has been around forever, but it takes on a whole new meaning when we start talking about AI. AI can produce an answer that sounds polished, confident, intelligent, and completely convincing, and it can still be wrong. That is where hallucinations come into conversation. The language may sound right, the grammar may be perfect, and the explanation may be impressive, but sounding right does not automatically mean that the information is right. And it certainly does not automatically mean the system understands what it is saying. Think about the difference between memorizing information and actually being able to use it. I could explain to you exactly how to change a tire, where the jack goes, how to use the lug wrench, how to loosen the lug nuts, remove the tire, put on the spare, tighten everything back up, lower the car, and check your work. You might even be able to write every step down on a piece of paper, all memorized. You could pass a test on changing a tire. But that's completely different from getting a flat tire on I-83 or 95 or I-90, wherever you're at. Now you're pulling over on the side of a road. Cars are flying past you. You open the trunk, pull out the jack, and start trying to figure out exactly where everything goes. Then you get the wrench out, and whoever put that tire on the last time apparently thought those lugs needed to survive a hurricane. Now you've got a real situation. The experience creates a different type of knowledge. Information becomes practical. And you begin to understand not only what to do, but when to do it, why you're doing it, and how to adjust when something does not go exactly according to plan. Artificial intelligence can describe that process, organize the steps, and generate the language of experience. But it has not been standing on the side of I-83 or a highway when cars are flying past it while you're standing out there on the highway loosening a lug nut. There's a difference between having information about an experience and actually having the experience. And when we forget that distinction, fluent language can fool us into assuming that there is more understanding behind the words than there actually is. That brings me to something else I was thinking about today. I was watching a podcast featuring Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, and he made a point that I thought was very interesting and it stayed with me. He described data, essentially, as a digital representation of human experience. Think about that. A digital representation of human experience. The books we write, music we record, pictures we take, videos we create, research we conduct, conversations we have, our history, decisions, successes, and even our mistakes can all become data. Human beings create experiences, and pieces of those experiences can then be represented digitally and used by machines. So the information going into artificial intelligence ultimately comes from human activity and human experience. But we have to remember something very important. The representation of a human experience is not the same thing as having a human experience. The machine can process the record of what happened, identify patterns across millions or billions of examples, and compare information faster than any individual human being ever could. But the output itself is not a lived human experience. And there's another layer of this. Human experience is not one single perspective. Everybody sees things differently. Two people can experience exactly the same event and walk away remembering completely different things. That reminds me of a funny story involving my parents. I remember playing a jazz concert where I invited both of them. It was a big concert. There's probably like 3,000 people there. And at the end of the show, I introduced them to the band leader. He asked my dad, "What was your favorite part of the show?" My dad said, "Oh man, that solo on the third song that you took, incredible. You went up to the high register and then came down. Woo-wee." And then the band leader looked at my mother. And he asked, "What was your experience? What was your highlight of the show?" And she said, "Oh, wow, it was incredible. When the drummer took off his shoes in the second tune and played the whole rest of the show with nothing but his big toe." We all broke out laughing. We couldn't believe that was the most memorable thing of the whole 2-hour concert. It was really unbelievable. It was hilarious, but that story actually says something very important. My parents watched the same concert in the same room at the same time, listening to the same band. My father focused on the music, while my mother noticed this unusual visual detail. Neither experience was necessarily wrong. They were simply paying attention to different things, and I mean completely different things. And that is what human perspective does. We filter information through our own interest, experiences, expectations, observations, education, culture, background, and history. Two people can receive the exact same information and assign completely different meaning to it. That becomes extremely important when we talk about artificial intelligence. Data may capture pieces of human experiences, but human experience is never just one thing. It consists of countless perspectives. So when AI gives us an answer, we have to remember that the answer comes from patterns within data. While human understanding also includes interpretation, perspective, judgment, and context, sometimes one person hears the solo on the third song, and sometimes another person notices the drummer has no shoes. Both observations tell us something about what it actually means to experience the world. So maybe the more interesting question is not simply, does artificial intelligence understand? Maybe the question we should be asking is, what do we mean by understanding in the first place? Interestingly enough, the question goes back to long before Chat or Gemini. In 1950, mathematician and computer scientist Alan Turing wrote this famous paper, Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence. It's something to read. You got to check it out if you haven't. Turing started with an enormous question: can machines think? But he recognized very quickly that the word thinking itself creates a problem. How do we define thinking? How do I know that you are thinking? And how do you know that I am thinking? When we cannot climb inside another person's mind and watch their thoughts taking place. So rather than spending all this time trying to define the word thinking, Turing reframed the problem. He proposed what became known as the Imitation Game, which later became closely associated with what we call the Turing Test. The basic idea was to evaluate the machine through observable behavior. If you were having a conversation through text and could not reliably determine whether you were communicating with a human being or a machine, then perhaps the machine had demonstrated something significant about intelligent behavior. I think that question is even more fascinating today because we are actually living in the kind of world Turing was imagining. Millions of people now have conversations with machines every single day. We ask follow-up questions, joke with them, challenge them, tell them they're wrong, ask them to simplify something or make it more technical, and ask them for ideas and advice. Sometimes the conversation becomes so natural that, for a moment, we stop thinking about the fact that there's no human being sitting on the other side. But remember, everything we've been talking about throughout this episode. Behavior that looks like understanding is not necessarily proof of understanding. A child can repeat an adult. A music student can memorize an incredible solo. And an AI system can generate an extraordinary paragraph. In each case, the important question is what happens when the situation changes? Can the information be transferred? Can it be evaluated and placed into a new context? Can mistakes be recognized? Can somebody explain not only what the answer is, but why the answer matters? Maybe that is why human understanding remains so important. Human beings don't simply collect information, we experience things, interpret them, disagree, change our minds, make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, and assign meaning to what happens to us. As we saw with my parents at the concert, the same experience can produce two completely different understandings. And I think that is important as we move deeper into this age of artificial intelligence. The question may not simply be whether machines will eventually sound more and more human. I think we already know they will. The hardest question is, as machines become better at producing the language of understanding, will we become better at recognizing what genuine understanding actually requires? Because getting the right words, repeating the right information, and predicting what comes next are all one thing. But knowing what those words means, Understanding why they matter, recognizing when the situation has changed, and deciding what to do with the information is something else entirely. And I think that may be one of the greatest responsibilities we have as educators, artists, parents, leaders, students, and simply as human beings. AI is getting better at giving us answers. Our responsibility is to keep getting better at asking what those answers actually mean. All right, everybody, that brings us to the close of another episode of The Jazz Architect. Keep your eyes and ears open, stay kind, and be a groovy person. And remember, being creative and innovative is the best way to start and end your day. I'm Richard D. Johnson, The Jazz Architect. I'll see you the next time.